Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to Misinformation in Science and Society. Here to listen, not to judge. I'm your host Annie, and today with us we have Scott Timcke, who is a comparative historical sociologist. So let's just get started. Could you please introduce yourself a little bit and what do you do?
My name's Scott Timke, and I'm a comparative comparative historical sociologist who's interested in subjective comprehension in capitalism. In other words, how do people think in our current economic system, and how does that help or hinder uh, attempts to change it to make it a little bit more inclusive, better, less alienating for people more broadly.
So, if you don't mind, why did you choose this career initially?
I mean, I don't know if I chose it so much as it was something I found out myself very good at. But I think it's sort of just you end up sort of following things that you tend to be good at, and you see that where it takes you. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I I wasn't particularly very good at school. I thought that one needs to reserve your energies for like the long marathon that is higher education. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but I was always interested in politics, questions about not only like how power is used and the struggles around power and with power, but ultimately like what is power to be used for? Like, some people just want it for its own sake, but some people want it to do something with it. In other words, they want to use it as a productive force to make something in the world. And I'm very
Mm-hmm.
much interested in the making of what power does to make things, what is being made. So it's sort of beyond the sort of the drama of politics, and more about like what is it actually doing for us.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so what's your favorite part of doing what you do now, kind of? Like a specific part, maybe?
I mean, I would say rewriting. I mean, one of the things about sort of the work that sort of academics do is we write a lot. We talk a
Mm-hmm.
lot. I mean, I think we should listen a little bit more too, but a lot of it is sort of like very much like output based. We talk a lot, we write a lot.
Uh-huh.
Um, and we write all kinds of things like books, articles, blog posts, all kinds of things. But the thing I like the most about the writing element is sort of trying to get things right. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we don't really get to do in speech so much. When we speak, things sort of like come and they just like rapidly fade. We
Mm-hmm.
can't really go back and edit things to get our expression right. So
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea that I can whatever I put down, I can then revise and try to make it correct. Like maybe writing is the attempt, I think, to sort of try make myself less wrong.
Uh-huh. Yeah, for sure. So, so you sent me your writing. So how did you when and how did you start this piece, I guess?
So this is a piece that comes out of a larger project of mine, which resulted in a book last year called "Algorithms and the End of Politics." And one of
Mm-hmm.
the things, one of the project is about how algorithmic reasoning, computational reasoning, is foreclosing the possibility to make appeals in our political process. In other words, like there are kinds of protocols or algorithms or computer code
Mm-hmm.
that give directions for petty officials to make decisions. In other words, they guide decision making, and
Uh-huh.
mostly because those people at the very bottom don't have discretionary power. When it comes to places where power is exerted, like say the criminal justice system,
Mm-hmm.
policing, or welfare disbursements, the people who are enacting those decisions don't really have the power to make them. The decisions being made by a computer calculation, an Excel spreadsheet, rather than the person who's actually dealing with the case. And so, as my claim is that as these types of affairs become more commonplace, so there's less opportunity to appeal. So if you're working with, say, a social worker
Uh-huh.
and you're trying to get housing vouchers and the person denies you, you can say, well, look, I'm here, I can offer you more evidence, or I can make an appeal to you.
Mm-hmm.
These computer systems often don't provide that. You enter your information and they say yes or no. And so the thing to me is what happens when this type of logic is brought about our entire political system. does that really what are the prospects for genuine democratic community under those conditions? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's sort of like the large project. And part of that is thinking about, misinformation, disinformation, distortion, and, not really being able to fully perceive what's happening around us. And so
Oh.
this is sort of the problem for me. So I think we have, computer code foreclosing our political decision making, and then simultaneously not being able to perceive that that's actually occurring.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
so all in all, there are dramatic shifts taking place in the social, political, economic realm, and then we don't really have the tools at our disposal to comprehend not only the magnitude but the consequences of those shifts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why do you think that truth is like so important?
So the thing to me is not so much truth per se. Like there was this very famous American political philosopher called Richard Rorty, and he
Mm-hmm.
said like he's an American pragmatist. Pragmatism is a very long intellectual tradition in the States, which is about practical reasoning. And so the short version is he says, we know what truth is. We know that when we use it in this circumstance, it means this. When we meet it in that circumstance, it means that. That often when we get you to say that's not true, it has a particular type of speech act. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When you say, oh, that's not true, it means that that acts, it's unbelievable or it's hard to believe, things of
Uh-huh.
that sort. So we understand that when people appeal to truth, they mean it in many different ways, right? One
Mm-hmm.
of the things that I see at the moment is that when people are fighting about truth, they're trying to make it one thing, knowing but failing to recognize that when people use truth in everyday language, they mean multiple different things. They mean disbelief, they mean alarm, they mean degree of certainty, they mean something, they mean a high probability, and all
Mm-hmm.
those things, are not truth itself, but people use the word truth to refer to these things.
Oh.
And so Richard Rorty says, we don't. The problem isn't that we misuse the word truth, but like the truth is elastic because it serves the interests of the speaker at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's sort of true in misinformation. Misinformation is one of these terms that is very elastic. It's stretched to encompass a whole range of circumstances. I'm sure, sort of in your project here, you've seen people speak about misinformation in a variety of different ways, and that's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily good or bad. They're using it in a variety of ways to talk about a bunch of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing is important about truth. Truth is very valuable. It's important to have a high degree of certainty about things. We want to know under what conditions, say, a bridge is going to fail when you put a lot of weight on it. These things are important because we don't want to drive lots of trucks over bridges and have them collapse. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously, having knowledge and certainty about facts in the world is very, very important. At the same time, though, when it comes to like the truth wars that are currently being fought, I think too many people are trying to put so much emphasis on saying that what they believe is absolutely certain, rather than recognizing that the vast majority of things that we have high, less, greater or lesser degrees of certainty and confidence in them, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, this goes back, and sorry to end up sort of talking a little bit longer over here, but one of the things about sort of empirical modern social science and natural science and hard science is
Mm-hmm.
that most scientists don't really search for truth; they search for more confidence in predictive ability, and that gives their models that they use to understand the world more confidence. They have higher confidence in the models that they use in order to make predictive claims.
Mm-hmm.
But we, as an ordinary people, we don't really think like that. We think that scientists are searching for truth. But the thing about sort of modernity is that it's about provisionality. All the statements we make are provisional. They could be subject to revision because we could get better information. We could know more about a topic. We
Mm-hmm.
once we once thought that bees, worked like this, and now we understand that bees work like that. So what we understand to be true about like bee colonies is radically different because we've collected more information. Well, so
Mm-hmm.
back to the point about like the truth wars that are going on at the moment, sometimes I find that people who advocate strongly for finding the truth
Mm-hmm.
are trying to close down inquiries to find out more information about the things that are important around us. So inadvertently, the people who are advocating most strongly to find the truth don't want us to uh, do more elaborate studies about what's going on around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know you already talk about like capitalist ideology and like with misinformation. So why do you think misinformation is like such a big issue, especially like right now?
I mean, I think it's a big question, and I gotta try to eat it like look one bite at a time, right?
Uh-huh.
I think one of the things about misinformation is that it's a function of party politics.
Mm-hmm.
You believe that, we believe this. You don't have a clear idea of the reality of the world, and so the party propaganda that you're putting out, is a distortion, is trying to change the perceptions of people, and so I think that's at one level we've used this term misinformation to try and give the pretense of scientific social scientific legitimacy to try to discredit what the other side is saying.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that some political parties don't have very destructive platforms. And that's obviously true. Across the world, you can see very conservative parties having very destructive platforms.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, though, using this term misinformation to simply to try and smear the other side, I think is trying to wrap up ordinary party politics in with sort of the general crisis of the age, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that case, it gets back to one of the things I said earlier about like misinformation being a very elastic type of term,
Mm-hmm.
because when you think about like the ways in misinformation is used, it's used in like a geopolitical context between superpowers fighting against each other. Russia is using misinformation to try and undermine Western imperialism. Okay,
Uh-huh.
or misinformation is people who are denying basic basic knowledge about how bacteria spreads, right? We see this in the coronavirus pandemic we've had the last couple of years. Or misinformation is about how a party is trying to distort reality in order to
Mm-hmm.
tweet wedge issues so that it can increase its turnout at the polls. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that when you use misinformation across all of these different spheres of life, the only thing you really have in common is the claim that people have distorted the world. But this gets back to the thing I said earlier about like the type of the insistence about what is true and what is not true, but more importantly, not about what is true and what is not true, but the truth. In a sense that all these types of discussions, the way that these discussions are framed, the way that they're set up, the way that they're organized, ends up foreclosing attempts to discover more about what's actually going on, or what types of information we could learn that may alter our comprehension of the issue at hand.
Mm-hmm.
So this, to me, to sort of sum it up, I find that misinformation is a very slippery term that if you don't really define it well for your particular area, it ends up doing a lot of discursive labor. It does a lot of discursive work, and it can sometimes end up uh, creating more confusion than clarity.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, what do you uh what do you think is like would you say political misinformation is the worst type of misinformation then?
I mean, I think that there's a lot of people who are using misinformation to smear their opponents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we see this in the United States quite frequently, right? Like the Republicans will say, or conservative Republicans will say, that trans people they desire to live in a way that they want to. They want to exercise their freedom
Mm-hmm.
expression of their identity, the way they
Mm-hmm.
want to move in the world, and they say, oh well, you're misinformed. You don't understand about your own identity. There's only two sexes, and they confuse sex and gender, and they make trans people the subject of an intense political targeting in order so that they can try secure and consolidate their base, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, and so they would say, okay, well, it's true that there's just men and women, and and these are just replays of other long-standing fights in the American political system.
Mm-hmm.
But and so, you then have people counter that and say, well, you're misinformed about how gender works. Okay, or how, what the social basis of gender happens to be. That gender is a social construct that people are able to enact through embodied action, thought. You're able to reframe themselves and in multiple different ways,
Mm-hmm.
and so on and so forth. And so both sides end up, and all parties in this matter end up sort of yelling at each other, saying that there's a lot of misinformation about what is true, and that sort of
Mm-hmm.
gets back to the truth wars at hand. And but throughout all of these discussions over here, what a lot of activists recognize, and and most people in the trans community themselves experience, is that all of this language ends up putting them, in the spotlight in social and political discussions. Oftentimes, when they haven't asked to be at the spotlight, most people in this community, like everyone else, want to go and live their lives as free and autonomous, individuals. But now they're being made the central subject in this political drama in which they are cast as the villain. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is one of the difficulties about misinformation is it creates this, heroes and villains. It's set up to create these heroes and villains kinds of narratives. And so often marginalized communities, people who are more vulnerable, end up being cast as villains in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they're just their lives are already difficult enough because of the social, economic, political system, and
Mm-hmm.
now they've just been made targets, and they can't avoid it. They're
Oh.
now central actors in this drama, in which their lives are already difficult enough. And so I think this is one of the difficulties about like misinformation politics, about like heroes and villains. And all these political parties, all these political projects require heroes and villains. And sort of as from a social scientific analysis, there are no heroes or villains per se. They're people who are advancing projects that may create harm or may lessen harm for different types of in different types of ways. And so often what this type of discussion does is it greatly simplifies the social forces at play over here. In one way, there's the attempt to try and make things comprehensible to the ordinary person.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, what it does is it very much double down, underscores that there are heroes and villains. And if you have a villain, you are creating a social license for them to be targeted. And I
Oh.
think that's a very big problem, because at least in my view, trans people should be, they're free and autonomous, and they should be able to, like everyone else, who are free, autonomous, self-determining agents. They should be able to live however they choose to live. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think it's much more simple than that. But yet they're now the target of a whole bunch of vitriol that they didn't choose. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that again, they're now targeted for political persecution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so what do you think about the invention of like technology and its impact on misinformation? Because I know you talk about like propaganda kind of and like Red Scare and stuff in your writing. So what do you think about the like invention of technology and
You want again, I'm gonna try to take that question like sort of one bite at a time. Um, the the one thing I'll go back to the book that I wrote last year, Algorithms and the End of Politics.
mm-hmm.
One of the things that I find that as our political systems become more technologicalized, in other words, that technology now starts to play a much more important role in
Mm-hmm.
politics, not in terms of like how messages are sent or how money is sought after, but like technology becomes a way of thinking about how to do politics well. That like the good politician understands that technology is something that should automatically always be advanced, right?
Uh-huh.
I mean, in the United States, I don't know how many national level politicians are saying like, "Whoa, maybe we need to rethink technology as such." Then maybe some of them will say, "Okay, well, I don't like how Facebook is doing this to my political party."
Mm-hmm.
So there are very few people who they're very selective critiques, whether it's Amy Klobuchar or Josh Hawley. They're very specific critiques. They don't have general critiques of technology. So what happens is that technology is automatically always seen as a good thing. And so more technology is more good things. The problem with that type of view is it forecloses our ability to think a little bit critically about what technology is doing. And more importantly, in the doing, how it's re-altering the balance of power between different groups in society. Is
Uh-huh.
it is more technology creating opportunities for the ruling class, the rich, capitalists, people who are shareholders to acquire more power? Or is it taking power away from laborers, from the working class, from from ordinary people? What is it doing to the reconfiguration of power within a society?
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things about technology in the United States, because the United States is such a capitalist society, is subject to intellectual property regimes. It's subject to proprietary rights. It's part of the public property regime. The private property regime, which means that the more technology you have, the more you're putting out private property, you're installing private property uh, as the means in which politics is done. And
Uh-huh.
so, where politics used to be a public exercise,
Mm-hmm.
it's now becoming much more privatized because of the reliance upon ways of thinking, ways of doing systems that are owned by shareholders, and
Mm-hmm.
because of in the United States, 10% of the people there own 60% of the shares of most companies. This deploying these types of systems greatly advances their interests over the people who are subject to those types of systems. So
Uh-huh.
you start to have a greater imbalance you have a greater widening of power, a greater imbalance, a reconfiguration of power. And so
Mm-hmm.
all of these things start to change the way that politics is conducted. Not necessarily what the things that people are fighting about, but the way it's sort of being done. And
Mm-hmm.
so again, it gets back to one of the things I'm trying to raise about when I think about misinformation, is that sometimes we don't fully perceive or understand or comprehend this dramatic shift taking place. And so
Mm-hmm.
we end up thinking about technology in using old assumptions. We haven't really updated our assumptions to match the reality that we're in. Now, again, you speak to a lot of social scientists, a lot of political philosophers, and they would say that these things are all commonplace. The things that I'm saying to you aren't controversial in universities,
Mm-hmm.
but when you speak to people, in the street, and again, I don't want to say that people in the street are different from those people in the universities. It's the same types of people. Man, they say they come from the same types of communities. They're not, people in the universities aren't special. That's not what I'm saying. But rather the types of assumptions that are commonplace at universities haven't yet filtered down into everyday life. And so often people in everyday life aren't able to fully comprehend what's happening in politics around them because they're working with an old set of assumptions. And that also gets back to a question of misinformation, because now people who are working with old assumptions see these new developments, they can't quite make sense of it. And when people say, well, these are new assumptions these are new realities, these are new assumptions that are taking place, they're now causes perpetuating misinformation. So
Mm-hmm.
this gets back into the very complicated dynamic where, to get back to one of the central threads throughout this interview, is that misinformation becomes a very slippery term
Mm-hmm.
that isn't quite supple enough to capture what's going on in our politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so what would you say is like would be the best way to like eliminate or avoid or like reduce misinformation then?
I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that people are trying to do. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, like there's the attempt to make social media. There's a big push by advocates to make social media enterprises responsible for the content that they broadcast or that they provide through their platforms, that they carry on their platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of a very technical exercise involving US regulation services. And I think that there may be some merit to that, but it always comes back down to like, what do we know to be true and how quickly are we updating what we know to be true? I mean, and just as a quick tangent over here, you have to remember that what we know is, you know, in the last 10, 15 years, we've almost doubled the amount of human knowledge that we had acquired before that point, right? And so if we keep on every couple of years doubling what we know, are our platforms going to be able to, be updated with the current state of human knowledge? So that's very difficult. So it's very hard to think about, how rapidly, so how are we going to be able to practically do this is something I think is something worth considering. To me, I
Mm-hmm.
think though that, it's not, I don't think that being able to regulate misinformation is the way to go forward. I think a lot of the things that misinformation is trying to do in the terms itself, we already have policies, disposals, laws on hand in
Mm-hmm.
order to try and rectify this. For example, hate speech laws are very good at people who are trying to convey misinformation about marginalized populations or populations of color in the United States, right? So if you
Mm-hmm.
are perpetuating bigotry and calling for violence, well, we already have hate laws or anti-hate laws on the books. We don't need new misinformation laws, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you're talking about how this type of information and targeting and calling for violence or try to distort matters, we already have laws around defamation on the books. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that in many cases we don't really need to create new tools. We need to use the tools that we already have, whether it be anti-speech laws or defamation. We need to use them better. I mean, to I think that's for me. We haven't yet fully exhausted the usefulness of the tools we have at our disposal to be
Uh-huh.
able to determine whether we need new regulations or new laws for misinformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so I think that's all my questions about misinformation. So, just for fun, do you have like a role model?
I mean, it's hard to say. Like, I mean, I don't have a role model per se. I've met many people in my life who have various good virtues who
Mm-hmm.
I want to try and copy or try to in some way sort of make a patchwork quilt of it for who I am. Like, for example, my supervisor when I do my PhD, Rick Renault, uh, very very intelligent. But one of the things you never saw him do, he was reading books, but he was always reading books. You could always tell that he had read the latest book, but it seemed it he had a kind of effortlessness
Uh-huh.
that came through doing a lot of work when people weren't watching. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's the kind of virtue that I'd like to have, like that easy comfort that comes from doing a work when no one's still watching.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think about my supervisor when I was doing my master's degree, Sheila Menchie's in South Africa, and she was a very, very good diplomat. She's very, very good with her language, and so those are elements that you pick up along the way. So there's not really one person. I try
Uh-huh.
to sort of see the best in people, and if I can learn from them, I try to take it on as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any advice for people, especially like teens? It can be about like it can be just like in general or like
I mean, like I'm old, so that's a very I'm very far away. Like I don't have a TikTok account, so like what I have to say to young people these days is very far from the lived experiences that they're facing. I mean, I can only remember my high school, which was vicious. Like teens can be very vicious and mean to one another.
mm,
The only thing that I can say over there is keep on doing your best day to day, and in 10 years time, like the meanness, the viciousness, the pettiness, because children can be mean to one another.
Uh-huh.
That will pass, and things will be much more settled in 10 years time. So like whatever people are confronting, whatever challenges they have at school, like I understand that those things are real, and they impact people very hard,
Mhm.
and they can be very, very tough. But school ends, and school ends a lot quicker than people think. But
Mhm.
at the same time, like I'm old. Like I, don't, I'm sorry, I don't have much wisdom to offer to young people. I think I don't know. I don't. They live in much more complicated lives. I'm so glad that there was no social media accounts when I was a young person. Uh,
Mm.
I think Facebook came out when I was in university. When I was doing my master's degree. I'm so glad that like my 13-year-old, like I'm very smart thoughts aren't like on a chat log somewhere, because I would be so embarrassed.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I think that will be it for today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Annie. I very much appreciated our chat.
Yeah, me too. Right, thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye.